Cimmerian September, the time of year when aficionados of Texan author Robert E. Howard read and discuss his original Conan stories, may technically be over. But let's not let that get in the way of exploring one of the original Conan stories, which is right now being adapted by Titan Comics, namely The Frost Giant's Daughter. How accessible is the Titan adaptation to new readers, and for longtime fans, how does it compare to the previous adaptations? Let's find out. First, a point of order, and something I was very happy to be reminded of in the comments to the previous Conan video. I only ever called it Cimmerian September, because that's the convention that all Conan fans do. Both in the movies and audiobooks, Conan's homeland is referred to as Cimmeria, and it's wrong, and it's always been. He's no more from Cimmeria than his name is Sonen. You're only saying it wrong because of the relatively modern devolution of the pronunciation of the letter C. For real, look it up. My go-to example here is the Roman emperor we all know as Caesar, but in Roman times, his name was pronounced Kazar. This is why, in all Germanic languages, the word for emperor is some variation of Kaiser, and even the Russian title Tsar is derived from Gaius Julius Caesar. Getting back on track, my point here is that if Conan were real, he would have introduced himself as being from Cimmeria, which is something I can only hope future filmmakers and audiobook readers will take into account. So, in a belated tribute to Cimmerian September, let's move on to The Frost Giant's Daughter. Written in the spring of 1932, The Frost Giant's Daughter, also published as Gods of the North, is the second Conan story Robert E. Howard wrote, though chronologically it is the first story covering the life and times of Conan the Barbarian. Inspired by both Norse mythology as well as Greek mythology, as there are traces of both the legend of Atalanta as well as the legend of Daphne and Apollo. The story takes place just after a teenage Conan has left his native Cimmeria for the first time, but he hasn't traveled south into the civilized world just yet. That comes later. First, he traveled further north into the frozen wilderness, where he teamed up with a band of Asir who are at war with their neighboring Vanir. The story begins at the end of a battle, where only two warriors are still left standing, Conan and a Vanir. Everyone else is already dead. The two remaining combatants are both exhausted and injured, and Conan ultimately prevails, though not without receiving one final major blow to the head in the process. Battle won, exhausted and delirious, he wanders off into the frozen wilderness, where he will be sure to die unless he can find nourishment and shelter. Here, in the middle of the frozen wilderness, out of the blue, he encounters Atali, a beautiful, seductive young woman who is practically naked, clad only in a flimsy veil, in the freezing cold. She seemingly knows everything about him, and she's teasing and egging him on, encouraging him to chase her, implying that there will be a carnal reward waiting for him if he can catch her. Though this is not said in the story, I have heard elsewhere that when close to death, many are overwhelmed with a desire to procreate, and this certainly is the case with Conan, who follows her in hot pursuit, growing more exasperated and enraged by the second, until he finds himself surrounded by Atali's brothers, two frost giants. It would appear that she lured him to them, so they could slay him just for sport. But Conan is enraged now, and manages to turn the table on them, slaying them both. He then sets his sight back on a shocked Atali, who flees again, only for real this time. Normally, Conan is the perfect gentleman who, as a rule, would never have his way with a woman against her will, but in this particular situation, he makes it clear that he will make an exception from that rule. Side note, remember that years ago there was a live-action Conan series in development at Amazon, but then Jennifer Salke axed it, due to concerns around the toxic masculinity on display? Well, the pilot to that series was based on The Frost Giant's Daughter, and I imagine it may have been just around here that she made that decision. Back to the story, Atali then calls out to her daddy, Ymir, the god of the north, to save her. At which point, She is whisked away in a blaze of light, while Conan passes out. He wakes up surrounded by his Aesir comrades, who are trying to prevent frostbite from getting to him. It would appear the whole thing was just a mirage, an apparition, brought on by exhaustion and most notably that blow to the head. In his fist, though, Conan still holds the veil of the Frost Giant's daughter. The Frost Giant's daughter has been adapted a total of 5 times in the comics, the first time as Gods of the North by a relatively unknown Texan fanzine way back in 1968. And this is an official adaptation, as it had the blessing of Glenn Lord, the then literary agent of the Howard estate. I honestly wasn't even aware of this until very recently, and I learned of it from the Titan comics. You see, they end every single issue with some scholarly writings on the Howard and Conan Lord relevant to the issue at hand, and here even I learned something new. The first widely available adaptation, though, came from Marvel Comics in 1971, in the premiere issue of Savage Tales, the precursor to the Savage Sword of Conan. Written by Roy Thomas and illustrated by Barry Windsor Smith, this adaptation is arguably the single most faithful adaptation of the original story of them all, though it does slightly tone down Conan's words when he makes his intention to have his way with Atali plain. That one sentence aside, this is a page-for-page adaptation, which is why I used it to illustrate the story of the Frost Giant's daughter earlier in this video. Next, it was adapted for the launch of the Dark Horse Comics run in 2004, then written by Kurt Busiek and illustrated by Carrie Nord. The actual adaptation was in issue 2, while issue 1 was the lead-up and issues 3 through 7 the aftermath. This is another fantastic adaptation, where nothing is toned down, but the storyline did drag on for a bit after the actual adaptation. In my personal opinion, the Dark Horse run only truly found its feet in the subsequent storyline. Then it was adapted by French publisher Glénat in 2020, later published in English by Ablaze in their Cimmerian imprint for dubious copyright bypassing purposes. This one doesn't add any before or after. The focus here is on the Howard story itself, though unlike the previous Marvel and Dark Horse versions, major liberties are taken with the storyline. It greatly expands on the chase, adding whole new sequences, but in being a European comic, the real emphasis is on the sexuality and lust of Atali, and to this end it is more seductive, let alone more visually explicit, than the prior American versions. Also, the choice is made to replace the Frost Giants of Howard's story and the earlier adaptations with some fluffy polar bears. That's one way to interpret Frost Giant, I guess. And then finally, we get to the Titan version. The storyline is published in issues 13 through 16 of Conan the Barbarian, though strictly speaking, only issue 15 is the adaptation of the story itself. Because like Dark Horse, Titan adds the before, so issues 13 and 14 provide the backstory, and issue 16 the aftermath. Chronologically, this story takes place right after issue 0, last year's free Comic Book Day issue, which I discussed in the previous video on the first year of Conan at Titan Comics. Be sure to see that video if you haven't already. But so anyway, chronologically, we jump straight from issue 0 to issue 13. This is the way it's always been where Conan is concerned, and the way it should be. Before we get into the story itself, let me elaborate on that. Howard wrote the original stories out of order, though they would line up if you were to rearrange them and read them in chronological order. Roy Thomas did something similar with his Marvel comics as well, where the main title Conan the Barbarian was told in chronological order, but with strategic gaps in between storylines, where other stories from the anthology magazine Savage Sword of Conan and other specials chronologically would fit. As an early example, the very first issue from 1970 ends with Conan leaving Cimmeria, and as the second issue begins, he is much further north, and some time has obviously passed, and is sporting a different sword and attire. Readers didn't think twice about this at the time, as the stories and character development progressed perfectly fine from issue to issue and storyline to storyline. But with time, what happened between storylines was fleshed out, including the gap between issues 1 and 2. The 1971 adaptation of The Frost Giant's Daughter chronologically took place shortly after issue 1, and chronologically, that in turn was followed by the further adventures of Conan and his Aesir companions in a 1979 story in Savage Sword of Conan, which ended with them all captured. Conan quickly escaped though, which was covered in a story from the year before, where he, fleeing both wolves and his captors, sought refuge in a cave, where he fought a mummified Atlantean, in the process winning a new sword and obtaining wolf-skin attire. And yes, a few years later, this made it into the movie. But that aside, that's where he got his attire for his next chronological appearance, which would be the aforementioned Conan the Barbarian issue 2 back in 1970. The point here is that all of these stories were intended to be read in their publication order, as that's where the thematic build-up and character development was. Yet years later, when the interconnected stories were all out, they could be reread in chronological order for a whole new experience. And interestingly, over the course of the 4 standalone vintage Marvel issues I've covered here, which were released over several years, they covered the same ground Dark Horse spent 7 months covering, and that storyline was a slog, while Marvel could move on with the story right away. All of which is to say that the Titan approach is closer to that of vintage Marvel than Dark Horse, and in the process to Howard's original writings. The way Titan are doing it, the storylines can be read in release order and make perfect sense, as we saw with the Black Stone storyline covered in the previous video, or they can be rearranged and read in chronological order and still make perfect sense. Though so far, it seems like it will be much easier to rearrange the Titan stories in their chronological order than it was in the case of vintage Marvel. So, after all that lead up, let us now get into Titan Comics and Jim Zub and Doug Braithwaite's adaptation of The Frost Giant's Daughter. As I mentioned earlier, The Frost Giant's Daughter is part of the overall Frozen Faith storyline, covering issues 13 to 16, 4 issues like the past storylines that will fit nicely into one paperback. Issue 13 takes place just after issue 0, with Conan heading north. As he deals with the local wildlife and applies his survival skills in a climate even harsher than what he's used to, we see flashbacks to when he was a child and first learned how to fight and survive. And initially, he was something of a slow learner, but fire soon awakened within him, and these flashbacks set the stage for the themes of this whole storyline. Fans of the movie will also be sure to appreciate his father telling young Conan about their god Crom. Towards the end of the issue, when he returns to his campsite with his kill, he finds a pack of roaming Aesir waiting for him there, looking for trouble, while in the distance, Atali watches on in interest. In issue 14, Conan and the Aesir that wants to steal his kill and kill him in the process fight, but they are interrupted by the Aesir leader, who offers Conan safe passage through their land, if Conan, who is obviously a skilled hunter, will share his kill and lend them his hunting skills for 7 days, to which Conan agrees. Conan and the Aesir bond and exchange information on their respective gods, lands, friends and foes, all while Atali watches from the distance. Initially, she was watching her own people, but she's fascinated by this stranger. The Aesir camp is however attacked by the Vanir, and horrified by their savagery, Conan joins the ranks of the Aesir, not as a mere hunter, but as a warrior, and they all engage the Vanir in brutal battle. In the just-released issue 15 comes the adaptation of The Frost Giant's Daughter, though here the alternate title, Gods of the North, is used. And just like in the original story, it picks up with only Conan and one Vanir still standing. Conan prevails, but dazed and injured, he wanders off where he encounters Atali, whom we now know knows everything about him because she's been watching him from afar for several days already. That is the outwardly difference here from the earlier Marvel and Dark Horse adaptations. While this story-wise is 100% accurate to Howard's original, we now see things from Atali's perspective. We can read her inner monologue and learn more of her plight, and while Conan is oblivious to it, we learn that there was more to the sudden appearance of her brothers than we were led to believe in past adaptations. Issue 16 has not yet been released as of the making of this video, but I was given early access to a preview copy for review purposes, though I am not at liberty to share any artwork from it just yet. What I will say though, without spoiling the story, is that this issue sees Conan trying to come to terms with his meeting with Atali, and with her, the hidden world of the supernatural, which he at this point in his life has never been exposed to before. This is where all the themes that have been built up and developed over the course of the past 3 issues, about spirituality, faith, and doubt, all come to their conclusion in what I consider to be a brilliant way. Just like what Dark Horse did for their relaunch, Jim Zub incorporated the Frost Giant's daughter into a larger narrative, but in Dark Horse, the story had no further significance. Here, the entire storyline has thematically been written around the Frost Giant's daughter, and its philosophical implications. All in all, another win, which I highly recommend. If you've never read Conan before, this is excellent introductory material, and no prior homework is needed. If you're a long-time fan, this is a great new spin on a story you already know. All comic book adaptations of the Frost Giant's daughter are great, and this is up there with the very best of them. Issues 13, 14, and 15, and soon 16, are all available at your local retailer. Or failing that, directly from Titan's website, both in print or digitally by way of Comixology. Be sure to check them out and let me know your thoughts on them in the comments. Also, before you go, as some of you know, we are hard at work making content for our brand new channel, Midnight's Edge Classics and Retrospectives. A channel where there will be no news, no live streams, no coverage of divisive Hollywood politics or ensuing culture wars. Only in-depth retrospectives of the coolest movies ever made, and even our own versions of some of the greatest public domain movies available. And we'll begin with Nosferatu, the Midnight's Edge Experience, comprised of a 40-minute ultimate retrospective, as well as the full unabridged movie in a new presentation featuring an original score. Let's round this video out with the trailer for it.
Coming soon, experience the classic Nosferatu like you never have before. Nosferatu, the Midnight's Edge Experience, with an entirely new score and soundtrack. Celebrating the launch of our brand new channel, Nosferatu, Symphony of Horror, the Midnight's Edge Experience.